How wide is the rift between Europe and the United States? The French president says the White House is undermining transatlantic relations and Europe may have to defend itself. Can Europe live without the US? This is an Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Paranam. With friends like Donald Trump, who needs enemies, that was the reaction from European Council Chief Donald Tusk when the US president withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions. Well, EU leaders want to save the nuclear deal and multi-billion-dollar business contracts, but European companies are bowing to US demands by pulling out of Iran, including British Airways and Air France, which are grounding flights to Tehran. That's despite revised EU legislation called blocking statute. It's aimed at nullifying US legal action against European firms which defy US sanctions on Iran. And the EU agreed to $21 million in aid to Iran to help offset the impact of sanctions. Now, Germany's foreign minister has called for independent payment channels to be created, which would avoid US sanctions. In a newspaper article, Heiko Maas said it's indispensable that we strengthen European autonomy by creating payment channels that are independent of the United States, also creating a European monetary fund and an independent SWIFT. First, US sanctions are back in force. In this situation, it's of strategic importance that we clearly tell Washington we want to work together, but we will not let you act over our heads. And the French president has criticised Donald Trump. Emmanuel Macron said Europe's historical partner seems to turn his back on this common history.
The first threat, which is a burden on our shared well-being, is the crisis of multilateralism itself. Multilateralism is in fact going through a major crisis, which is striking all of our diplomatic relationships, above all because of the new American policy. The real question is not so much to know if I will take Donald Trump by the arm during the next summit, but how we will collectively get to the grips with this moment of great transformation we're going through and to which all of our societies are confronted with.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Berlin is Thorsten Benner, the director of the Global Public Policy Institute. In Harvard, Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook, executive director of Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard Kennedy School. And in Brussels via Skype is Daniel Gross. He's the director of the Center for European Policy Studies. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Benner, let me start with you in Berlin and your foreign minister's op-ed where he wrote, "Making plans for a new world order." Are Europe and the US on a collision course here?
Not necessarily, but in a course of readjustment. We find ourselves in a fundamentally new situation with the US. Germany used to have the best deal of all. US would take care of our security. We can compete economically and disagree politically. Now the Trump administration has served us our vulnerabilities on a silver platter. The security guarantees are no longer secure, and the US is going against the very institutions it helped to create that are dear to Germany and the Atlantic Alliance. And they're also going against one of the biggest achievements of European diplomacy, the Iran deal. And here Europe is saying we need to invest in our own strategic autonomy, financial autonomy. That's what Mr. Maas was talking about in this particular piece is one part of the puzzle.
I want to talk more about that financial autonomy because the Iran nuclear deal, as you said, is so important to Europe diplomatically. Mr. Gross, let me bring you in now. This alternative payment system to the dominant SWIFT. We have heard from others, not just Heiko Maas, that the European Commission has been developing a parallel system to SWIFT, which would allow Iran to interact with European financial systems. How viable is this?
I don't think we can build up a special payment system just for one country, Iran, which after all is of very limited economic and financial importance. Actually, when we talk about payment systems, we shouldn't forget that the dominant global payment system is SWIFT, which is Europe. It's a European company which is under the jurisdiction of the European Commission, therefore. So in this sense, it's wrong to say that we need a new European payments or new global payment system to rival the United States dollar. What we need is different financial markets so that we wouldn't need our European companies to list in the United States or to have lots of dealings with US financial markets. That's the real problem, not so much the pure payment system.
Ms. Kluwer-Ashbrook, let me bring you in now. The financial sort of markets and arrangements that Mr. Gross is talking about, wouldn't that be even more difficult to establish than an alternative payment system to SWIFT? I mean, what do you make of these alternatives that are being proposed to counteract US sanctions?
I think a critical component here is timing. You can have many thoughts and sketch out many plans on your sketchbook, whether it's in Brussels or in any of the national capitals. The problem here, the main problem, both on the defense side, which my colleague Thorsten Benner mentioned implicitly in terms of putting up a robust defense, if you will, or a robust response to American actions in the world, that is going to be as difficult to do quickly as it is to build essentially a new financial transaction system or a financial transaction system that would undercut the predominance of the dollar in the financial markets. And to figure out how long that would take, I think we're talking clearly about decades from now for that to be as impactful as the system we have now. So that would be a system that in some respects would long outlive this administration, and then European governments would have to decide how tactical and how strategic that kind of investment would really be to them, or whether it's worth investing in critical negotiations with partners and trying to work with the practical realities that exist on the ground right now.
Mr. Benner, do you think that Europe is thinking actually more long-term here, more long-term than just counteracting these latest US sanctions?
Yeah, the Iran sanctions are just a trigger, and Europe is well aware that they likely won't pull this off until November, when it would need to be in place to salvage the Iran deal. For salvaging the Iran deal, I think we very much have to rely on China providing a lifeline to Iran by increasing or securing the oil exports, and also using independent payment systems that the Chinese have. But clearly this has triggered a rethink in Europe, actually a rethink that was predicted by US Treasury Secretary Jack Lew during the Obama administration. He said, he warned of sanctions overreach. I do think that this weaponizing of interdependence and choke points, and SWIFT is one. SWIFT may be a European institution, but it's at the mercy of American pressure. And we've seen that many times with regard to Iran. That's why it is indeed important for Europe to develop these alternative payment channels. The US will certainly try to prevent this by playing divide and rule. Mr. Maas himself has said the devil is in 1,000 details. This is something you announce once, and then you quietly go about trying to pull this off. This will be very hard to pull this off, but it's worth trying.
Well, in the meantime, we do have something that is in place, which is the blocking statute to nullify US legal action against European firms doing business with Iran. Mr. Gross, is the statute effective, and how many European businesses, are willing to risk to continue doing business with Iran and still face US sanctions? We've had the French oil giant Total pull out, as we've mentioned, British Airways and also Air France will stop flying to Iran soon, and these are just a few examples.
It is quite clear that no important European company will risk US sanctions just for a number of small deals in Iran. Iran is so marginal for European exporters, and when they make the calculation that maybe they get US sanctions, perhaps offset to some extent by the European blocking statute, but that is never 100% certain. So I think this European blocking statute will be of very limited effectiveness for large companies. It might help some SMEs in Europe who have no or little business in the United States, and they might continue to business, but that is really not the important point of this. I would also add that what my colleague said, that Europe here should be thinking long-term and should develop its own autonomous capacities. Mr. Maas has pointed in that direction. I think we have heard that before. I do not really expect to see a lot of action following these promises and these ideas, because the real problems of Europe lie elsewhere, and the political capital is just not there to develop these capacities.
Well, let's then broaden out this discussion, because Europe and the US have differences on a number of other major issues. The Trump administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from a range of countries in March. The EU responded with countermeasures. Donald Trump's criticized Europe's more open immigration measures in contrast to his zero-tolerance policies. The US withdrew from the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement last year, which the head of the EU Council, Donald Tusk, described as a mistake. And Trump has criticized NATO members for not contributing enough to fund the transatlantic military alliance. Ms. Kluver-Ashbrook, let me come to you. So with all those differences, now out in the open, have Donald Trump's isolationist policies, I think Mr. Macron called them aggressive isolationism, finally taken their toll on European leaders and now leading to policy making?
Well, I wouldn't say taking their toll. I see this as a continuation of outside forces really pushing the European Union, pushing individual member states to rethink their priorities. We have a situation where the Maas speech falls into a plethora of speeches that were made along the lines of the European Union really having to focus its energies on defense policies, on critical policies that underpin a European value system, not least the points that you've already mentioned around the Paris Climate Accord and the validity of international institutions like the WTO. So you mentioned President Macron. He gave a speech a number of months ago that was immediately where he stressed the importance of European defense independence, and that was immediately followed and buffeted by the German Chancellor. So in some respects, this speech by Heiko Maas follows a specific tradition almost now of rethinking what Europeans can do. And what we need to see now is rapid and focused action in some of these areas.
Yep.
And there I share my colleagues' skepticism that we can do this quickly enough to tackle the plethora of changes and challenges that are confronting the European Union at the same time.
You say rapid action, which is something that the French President Emmanuel Macron repeated on Monday. He said, he actually called this a crisis moment for global multilateralism. He also said that the post-war Western-dominated world was in danger. Mr. Benner, is it? And if, this sort of urgent action that he's calling for in terms of defense, because he's saying that Europe can no longer depend on the US for defense, well, what does that mean? And what does that mean for NATO?
I mean, Mr. Maas has 4 elements to his strategy, and I think they're all very cool-headed. One, and that responds to the Macron point on capabilities, is to finally invest in our own capabilities. Germany has been falling short on that, especially on the military front for a while now, and we really need to shape up. That's the first element and response to also what Mr. Macron is saying. The second is to have a counterbalance to the US, a soft balancing, if you will, where Mr. Maas said, cross red lines or do things that really harm European interests. That means this financial autonomy that we've been talking about, technological autonomy, in some issues is also part of the puzzle. The third is, and that comes to your multilateralism point, Mr. Macron has talked about new alliances. Mr. Maas has been a little bit more specific. He called for an alliance of multilateralists. He teamed up with Canada, with Japan, other middle powers who are committed to multilateralism, who are shocked by the America First strategy that the Trump administration is going against the very institutions that it helped create and that are underwriting European prosperity. That's, of course, an uphill battle, but it's something worth trying. And the fourth element of this Atlantic strategy or America policy of Mr. Mas is renewed engagement with the broader American public. The Trump administration doesn't represent the whole of America, and he has repeatedly said that in the greater scheme of things in the US, we still have the best shot at having an ally outside Europe. China and Russia are even less benign hegemons in their own ways, and not at all partners that could make up for the old role of the US.
Mr. Gross, what do you make of everything you're hearing? Can Europe sort of forge ahead with these new agreements, you know, new alliances and everything from financial markets to defence?
The short answer would be Europe could do it. The means are there, economically, financially, and even on the military side. But I must say, I doubt that the political will exists. We have all these speeches, but when these politicians go home and when they have to find majorities in their home domestic parliaments to create a European army or to create a European payment system, the people just don't follow them. In Germany itself, there's a very great resistance to increase expenditure on defense, even a little bit, although German public finances are in great shape. So I would say, yes, Europe should do it, but I very much doubt it will be done.
Ms. Kluwer-Ashbrook, what do you make of that? Are these countries, despite, you know, what we hear from, especially from Ms. Merkel and Mr. Macron, are they actually lacking the political will, the public support to create a new world order?
I would disagree with my colleague Daniel Gross a little bit. We have seen over the summer some very marked debates, particularly in the public, on things like defense spending and the future of German defense policy. There's been a very nuanced debate on whether Germany might have to consider getting a nuclear weapon now that the United States is retreating from the security architecture in Europe. Now, that came out to on the side of no, clearly of no, but what we're seeing in a lot of the questions that have been put to the German public, that the German public is actually ahead of its political class. They see that it could be important to invest more in German and in European defense spending. They're very aware now, after a prolonged debate within the German press and within the German media, of the needs for an integrated European defense policy. So I think there is some movement there. But again, I would point to the fact that that movement might not be quick enough to tackle all the challenges that a European Union faces from the south and from the east, particularly. You raised the migration question, but also an ever more aggressive Russia. Russia announced today that they will stage large military exercises in the coming months. And that is something that the European Union needs to find answers for, and it needs to find those answers quickly.
Yeah, European unity is, of course, a big question. Mr. Bannon, let me put something to you. We had the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying earlier this year that he's worried about the serious differences between Europe and the US and some of the world's most important issues. Is one of the sort of bigger problems here that are we in sort of uncharted territory when it comes to differences between Europe and the US?
As I said in the beginning, I mean, we've always had differences over the Iraq War, previously the Suez Crisis.
But have we had such big differences on so many different issues?
No, we haven't. What we haven't had before is the fundamental doubts about the viability of the alliance arrangement. That's why Europe needs to hedge. That's why Europe needs to have a plan B. Those doubts and the need for a plan B come at the worst possible moment, because Europe is besieged by anti-liberal forces also from within, and by anti-liberal authoritarian powers, Russia and China, from without. So it's a very precarious moment, but Europe doesn't have any other choice. I agree with Mr. Gross that, of course, it's easy to say Europe won't pull this off because there's so many countervailing forces. But those politicians who believe in Europe and who believe that even a big country like Germany is no longer sufficient to hold its own in this kind of tumultuous world. They need to kind of invest, try to convince the public and make the most of this situation that in terms of the turmoil is indeed unprecedented.
And should they use, the issue of Iran to come together and stand up to the US on this? Mr. Gross, I'll go to you.
I don't think Iran will make much effect, or will have much effect on European public opinion. The strongest support for European unity and action comes actually from Putin, from Trump himself by questioning the value of the alliance, to some extent by the dictatorial turn of Erdogan. So the more people in Europe perceive that they're surrounded by very unstable regimes, unstable states, the more, of course, the likelihood increases that something will be done. So to this extent, actually, what Trump is doing might have some beneficial impact. But as the colleague said, will Europe do it quickly enough? And the greatest danger I see that somebody on the outside miscalculates and thinks that somehow Europe is so disunited that a foreign power can take advantage of it.
Ms. Kluivert-Ashbrook, even if they can't do it quickly enough, Europe can't also afford to just wait and sit out this Trump presidency, can they?
No, and I think you've seen cohesive action, at least, for the European Union, large steps. They agreed last year on, particularly in the defense dimension, on what they call permanent structured cooperation. The European Union is working with NATO to define in which areas the European Union could have strategic autonomy. Mr. Maas added to his op-ed, if you will, yesterday in his speech to the collected diplomats of Germany that he is vested in also creating a civilian force, so to enhance civil-military cooperation. So there are different areas in which the European Union has the leeway, both legally and politically, to do more. It needs to figure out very clearly its relationship with NATO, and it cannot sit out what the Trump administration plans to do. In fact, we have known since the beginning of the Trump campaign that one of the goals of Mr. Trump himself and some few people within his administration to pick the European Union apart strategically, because then that would allow him to negotiate ideally, that's what he believes, none of that is true under European law, but to negotiate individually with European countries.
Which is, of course, what he prefers.
So there is a nefarious streak in the U.S. administration.
And
yes.
Mr. Bennett,
so
I'm going to give...
there needs to, the European Union...
I'm going to give Mr. Bennett the last word, Ms. Kluivert-Ashbrook, because we don't have very long left. So can this European Union remain united against this Trump presidency, do you think?
It is not united on a number of issues. For example, the Nord Stream dealing with Russia, there are divisions already, and the Trump administration, if it so wants, can play divide and rule very effectively with Europe. That's why countries like Germany, France, really need to invest very hard in maintaining European unity. There are a number of pills we probably have to swallow as Germany along the way. That means we cannot go against the illiberalism domestically of Poland and Hungary as forcefully as we would like to if we want to keep, for example, Poland and Hungary in the boat in confrontations with China and the US and Russia. So it's a tricky situation, but we have to keep trying.
Mr. Bennett, thank you very much. We'll have to end on that somewhat positive note. That is Thorsten Benner in Berlin, Catherine Kluivert-Ashbrook in Harvard, and Daniel Gross in Brussels. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Piranum, and the whole team here, bye for now.